Good afternoon. What I have with me today is an Ancestry DNA kit. Maybe some of you have taken these and sent them in. These kits have brought along a whole new interest, I think, in genealogy and our ancestry and where we came from. And it actually plays a really important part of our story today, this idea of ancestry and genealogy. So I'm hoping that not only have you read chapter 4 in the book of Ruth before watching this video, but I'm hoping that you have read Matthew 1, verses 1 through 17, and the genealogy that's listed there. It's a pretty important genealogy for us to consider as we look at this story that far precedes it. So how does this play into the book of Ruth? Well, let's look at the two main scenes of this chapter. And the first one I'm going to summarize very briefly. The beginning of this chapter is this kind of open public proceeding that Boaz has with this other next of kin to see who gets Naomi's field and who gets to or is willing to marry Ruth. And as it turns out, Boaz is the person that's going to marry Ruth. And we hear this beautiful blessing. This whole story has been filled with all these blessings that people speak over one another. But in this particular blessing, there's a line that I think is particularly poignant. And they pray over Boaz and Ruth. They say, "May you produce children in Ephrathah and bestow a name in Bethlehem." So I want you to keep that in the back of your mind as we continue here. So then in the second scene, the second big scene of this chapter is, of course, Ruth and Boaz get married and they have a baby, a son. And not only is it a son for Ruth and Boaz, but it's considered a son for Naomi. It's kind of almost like a happily ever after, and we don't get many of those in the biblical narrative. There's always human brokenness and human strife that kind of invade the stories, and the characters in the Bible don't always get to rest in that happiness, but this is such an amazing ending to this story. If you remember, we began in famine, and Naomi is bitter and empty and hopeless and does not sense a future for herself. And we get to end now in light of this abundant harvest with new life, this new life that a baby brings into a family, and hope and the promise then of an actual future for this family. And it just goes to show how even in our darkest circumstances that God can bring about just an abundant transformation. But what's so interesting about this story is that this transformation is not just for Ruth and Boaz and Naomi, and that's where this genealogy comes into play. This baby that they name Obed turns out to be the grandfather of King David. King David is considered the greatest king of all for the Israelite people. And so this little love story between Ruth and Boaz bring a king into the midst. But God's not even done with that yet. Because if we read through the whole Old Testament, you'll encounter prophecy after prophecy and promise after promise that the Messiah is to come out of the house of David, that it is going to be one of David's heirs that will be the Messiah. And so if you read that chapter in Matthew and you read the genealogy, you see that it's really true that Jesus comes out of this line of King David. And what's really interesting about that genealogy is that there are 42 generations represented in that genealogy, but only 5 women are mentioned, only 4 by name, and one is Mary, the mother of Jesus, but another one of those women is Ruth. This indicates that this story truly is an important part of God working in their lives to bring about to bring about the salvation of the world, that this story of Boaz, an Israelite, one of God's chosen people, and Ruth, a foreigner, can come together and be part of this incredible story that bestows not just a name in Bethlehem, but the greatest name in Bethlehem and the greatest name in the entire world, that of Jesus. And there's so much hope in that, because throughout the story we've talked about how God has just been working behind the scenes, so quiet and so subtle, and the characters have no idea where this is all going. And it's that way for us in life sometimes too, that we don't always know how God is working in our lives. But wow, the power that God can exhibit through these quiet, subtle workings is just incredible. And these are the stories that tell us then that when life is uncertain, when we don't know what's going on, we can simply continue to live out our faith in trust, knowing that God is up to something good for us. I hope this has been a fun and interesting story for you. I do hope you've seen the incredible ways that God works, not only in Ruth's life, but in ours as well. Have a blessed day.